I still remember the exact moment my lawyer looked at me across his polished oak desk and said something that made my stomach tighten. His office sat high above the busy streets of London, the kind of place designed to make clients feel small the moment they stepped inside. Shelves of thick law books lined the walls. Awards hung neatly in silver frames. Everything about Edward Whitmore screamed power and experience. And that was exactly why I trusted him. When I first hired him, I believed I had found the best lawyer I could afford. My name is Charlotte Whitfield, and at that time, my life was already tangled in a legal battle I never expected to fight. It started when a business deal went wrong with a man named Oliver Kensington, a wealthy investor who had a reputation for winning almost every case that reached a courtroom. Friends told me I needed someone tough, someone respected, someone who knew how the legal system worked. Edward Whitmore's name came up again and again. People described him as brilliant, ruthless, and expensive. But they also said if he took your case, you were in good hands. So I sat there that morning believing he was the man who would help me protect everything I had worked for. At first, the meeting seemed normal. He flipped through my documents slowly, adjusting his glasses while reading each page. Occasionally, he nodded as if confirming something in his mind. I tried to explain details about the agreement Oliver Kensington and I had signed months earlier, but Whitmore raised his hand gently, signaling me to stop. "Miss Whitfield," he said calmly, leaning back in his chair, "you are clearly very invested in this matter." I thought that sounded reasonable. Of course, I was invested. My reputation, my savings, and years of work were all tied to this case. But then he continued speaking, and that was when everything changed. "However," he said, tapping a pen against the desk, "you must understand something important. Legal matters like this require professional judgment. Clients sometimes allow emotion to cloud their thinking. In situations like yours, supervision becomes necessary." I blinked, unsure I heard him correctly. "Supervision?" I asked. Whitmore nodded, almost like a teacher explaining something to a child. "Yes. It would be best if you allowed me to guide the decisions without questioning every step. Trust the process. That's how these matters are handled." For a moment, the room felt strangely quiet. Outside the window, I could see London traffic moving normally, people walking, buses passing, life continuing as usual. But inside that office, I suddenly felt like something had shifted. I had walked in expecting partnership. Instead, I was being told I needed supervision. I forced a polite smile, though inside I felt a small spark of anger beginning to grow. "I hired you because I want the best strategy," I replied carefully. "But I also want to understand what's happening." Whitmore sighed softly, as if my response proved his point. "Miss Whitfield," he said, "clients who try to manage their lawyers often make situations worse. The best thing you can do is step back and allow professionals to handle the complexity." That sentence stayed with me long after the meeting ended. Clients who try to manage their own lawyers. The words echoed in my mind while I walked down the marble hallway toward the elevator. Something about the conversation didn't sit right with me. I had spent years building my business, negotiating contracts, and making difficult decisions. Yet in that office, I had been treated like someone who couldn't understand her own situation. When the elevator doors opened, I stepped inside and watched the numbers slowly count down toward the lobby. My reflection in the mirror looked calm, but inside, my thoughts were racing. Was I overreacting? Maybe this was just how high-profile lawyers spoke to their clients. Maybe confidence sounded like arrogance. Maybe supervision was simply another word for guidance. But another voice inside me whispered a different question. What if he wasn't respecting me at all? What if he already believed my case wasn't worth fighting properly? When the elevator reached the ground floor, I stepped outside into the cool London air and paused on the sidewalk. People rushed past me, busy with their own lives, unaware that a single sentence had just planted doubt in my mind. I had hired Edward Whitmore because everyone said he was the best. But as I stood there watching the city move around me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about that meeting was wrong. And what I didn't realize at that moment was that his words, those calm, confident words about supervision, would soon lead me to a decision that would completely change the course of my case. But before we go further into what happened next, make sure you hit the subscribe button and stay with this story, because what unfolded after that meeting proved something powerful. Sometimes the person you trust to defend you is the very person holding you back. And in my case, discovering that truth would turn my entire legal battle upside down. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about what Edward Whitmore had said in his office. The word supervision echoed in my mind again and again. I tried to convince myself it wasn't a big deal. Maybe I misunderstood his tone. Maybe this was simply how experienced lawyers talked when they wanted clients to trust their judgment. But the more I thought about it, the more uncomfortable I felt. I had hired him to represent me, not to make me feel like I wasn't capable of understanding my own case. By the time evening came, my head was full of questions, so I decided to do something simple. I called my friend Emily Carter. Emily had known me for almost 10 years. She was the kind of friend who didn't sugarcoat the truth, and sometimes that was exactly what I needed. We agreed to meet at a small cafe near the Thames, a quiet place where the smell of coffee and soft music made it easy to talk. When I arrived, Emily was already sitting by the window, stirring a cup of tea while watching the street outside. The moment she saw my face, she frowned slightly. "Charlotte," she said, "you look like you've been carrying a storm all day." I sat down across from her and let out a slow breath. "Maybe I have," I replied. Emily leaned forward, curious. "What happened?" I told her everything. I explained the meeting with Whitmore, the way he flipped through my documents, the calm voice he used when he said I needed supervision, and how he suggested I should stop questioning legal decisions. Emily listened carefully without interrupting. When I finished speaking, she stayed quiet for a moment. Then she asked a simple question that made me pause. "Charlotte, why would your own lawyer make you feel small?" I looked down at the table. "Maybe he didn't mean it that way," I said. "He's experienced. Maybe he just wants control over the strategy." Emily shook her head slowly. "There's a difference between guidance and disrespect," she said. "Did he explain the strategy clearly?" I hesitated. "Not really." "Did he answer your questions?" she asked. I thought about the meeting again and realized something uncomfortable. Whitmore hadn't answered most of my questions. Instead, he had brushed them aside as if they weren't important. Emily watched my expression change and nodded quietly. "Charlotte, when someone tells you not to ask questions about your own case, that's not confidence. That's control." Her words stayed with me the rest of the evening. When we left the cafe and walked outside, the city lights reflected on the river, and the air felt colder than before. On the way home, I kept replaying the meeting in my mind. For the first time, I stopped looking at Whitmore as the famous lawyer everyone respected and started looking at the details of what he actually did. When I reached my apartment, I placed my bag on the table and pulled out the folder containing all the documents from the case. Contracts, emails, financial records, and notes from meetings with Oliver Kensington were stacked neatly inside. I sat down and began reading them again slowly. At first, everything looked the same as before. But this time I wasn't reading as a worried client who trusted her lawyer completely. I was reading with a different mindset. I was looking for things that Whitmore might have overlooked. Or ignored. The hours passed quietly while I examined each document. Outside the window, the city grew darker as people went home and the streets became calmer. Around midnight, I noticed something strange. One of the email threads between Oliver Kensington and me contained a detail that Whitmore never mentioned. It showed that Oliver had agreed to a specific clause in the contract months before the dispute started. That clause was important because it directly supported my position in the case. I stared at the screen, surprised. Why hadn't Whitmore discussed this evidence? It wasn't hidden. It was right there in the documents I had given him. I flipped through the rest of the folder again, searching for notes or comments from Whitmore about that clause. There was nothing. My heart began beating faster. Maybe it was a simple mistake. Lawyers handled hundreds of pages of information in every case. Missing one detail could happen. But another thought crept into my mind, and this one made me sit up straight in my chair. What if it wasn't a mistake? What if Whitmore had seen this evidence and simply decided it wasn't worth using? I leaned back slowly and looked at the stack of papers in front of me. For the first time since hiring him, a serious doubt formed in my mind. Edward Whitmore was supposed to be protecting my interests. But what if he wasn't fighting for my case the way he should? And that was the moment when something changed inside me. The woman who walked into his office earlier that day believed she needed his approval to understand her own situation. But the woman sitting at that table now was beginning to realize something very different. Maybe I didn't need supervision at all. Maybe I needed answers. And what I would discover next would push me to make a decision that Edward Whitmore never expected. So if you think this story is getting interesting, make sure you subscribe and stay with me, because what I uncovered in the next made it impossible for me to trust my own lawyer ever again. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, but the truth was I hadn't really slept. My mind kept returning to the same question over and over again. Why had Edward Whitmore ignored that clause in the contract? It was not a small detail. It was the kind of evidence that could change how the entire case was viewed. I made coffee, sat at my kitchen table, and opened the folder again. Sunlight slowly filled the room while I reread every document, every email, every note I had taken since the dispute with Oliver Kensington began. The more I examined the papers, the more uncomfortable I became. That clause wasn't the only thing Whitmore had overlooked. Another email showed Oliver confirming a timeline that supported my version of events. A financial statement clearly showed a transfer that contradicted Oliver's claim. Yet none of these things had appeared in the strategy Whitmore discussed with me. According to him, the safest path was a quick settlement. But looking at the evidence in front of me, that idea no longer made sense. If the documents supported my position, why was my own lawyer preparing me to surrender? I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling for a moment, letting the silence settle around me. This wasn't just about one missed detail anymore. It was beginning to feel like a pattern. Whitmore had treated my questions like interruptions, dismissed important documents, and pushed for a settlement that seemed far too convenient for Oliver Kensington. The thought made my chest tighten. I didn't want to believe it. Hiring Whitmore had been a big decision. His reputation alone made me feel safe when the case first started. But now I couldn't ignore what was right in front of me. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I reached his office number. For a moment, my thumb hovered over the screen. Part of me wanted to call immediately and demand an explanation. Another part of me hesitated. I wanted to be sure before confronting him. Instead of calling, I decided to take a different step. I wrote down every detail I had noticed, listing each piece of evidence Whitmore had ignored. When I finished the list, I stared at the page quietly. It was longer than I expected. The realization settled over me slowly but firmly. Something about this situation was wrong. Later that afternoon, I returned to Whitmore's office building without scheduling a meeting. The receptionist recognized me and smiled politely. "Miss Whitfield, do you have an appointment today?" she asked. "No," I said calmly, "but I hoped Mr. Whitmore might have a few minutes." She checked her computer and then looked up again. "He's in a meeting at the moment." I nodded and took a seat in the waiting area. The office was as impressive as it had been the first time I visited. Quiet, polished, professional. But now it felt different. The confidence I once felt there had been replaced by a careful awareness. After about 20 minutes, Whitmore's office door opened, and he stepped into the hallway, finishing a conversation with another client. When he saw me sitting there, his eyebrows lifted slightly in surprise. "Miss Whitfield," he said, walking over, "I didn't realize you were coming in today." I stood and gave a polite smile. "I hope to ask you a few questions about the case." He glanced briefly at the papers in my hand and then gestured toward his office. Once we were seated, he leaned back in his chair just like he had during our first meeting. "What concerns you?" he asked. I placed the documents on his desk and pointed to the first page. "This clause in the contract," I said. "It confirms that Oliver agreed to the condition he now claims never existed. Why hasn't this been part of our strategy?" Whitmore glanced at the paper quickly and then leaned back again, looking almost bored. "Miss Whitfield," he said calmly, "you're focusing on technicalities." I blinked. "Technicalities?" "Yes," he replied. "Cases like this are rarely decided by isolated clauses or emails. The broader picture matters more." I felt a spark of frustration. "But this evidence supports our position," I said. Whitmore folded his hands together. "You're allowing emotions to guide your interpretation again. This is exactly why supervision is important in complex legal matters." The word hit me harder this time. Supervision. I looked at him carefully, studying the calm confidence in his expression. That was the moment when the final piece of doubt fell into place. Edward Whitmore wasn't simply overlooking the evidence. He was dismissing it. And he expected me to do the same. As I gathered my papers from his desk, a quiet realization formed in my mind. The biggest obstacle in my case might not be Oliver Kensington at all. It might be the man sitting across from me. And for the first time since this legal battle began, I started to consider a possibility that felt both frightening and empowering. What if the person who said I needed supervision was actually the person I needed to replace? If you're beginning to see where this story is heading, make sure you subscribe and stay with me, because the decision I made after walking out of that office would completely change the direction of my case and reveal just how wrong Edward Whitmore had been about me. When I stepped out of Edward Whitmore's office that afternoon, the air outside felt strangely fresh, like the city itself was telling me something had finally become clear. For days, I had been wrestling with doubt, trying to convince myself that Whitmore's attitude was just confidence, that his dismissal of my concerns was normal in the legal world. But after our second conversation, I understood the truth. Edward Whitmore didn't believe in my case. Worse than that, he didn't believe in me. And the moment that realization settled in my mind, something inside me shifted. The fear that had been sitting quietly in the background suddenly turned into determination. I walked a few blocks down the street before stopping near a small park bench. Cars passed, people hurried by, and somewhere in the distance a bus hissed to a stop. London moved forward like it always did, but I stood still for a moment, thinking about everything that had happened since this case began. Then I did something that felt both terrifying and freeing at the same time. I took out my phone and searched for another name I had heard before but never seriously considered. Amelia Grant. Unlike Whitmore, Amelia Grant didn't appear in glossy advertisements or large corporate law firm websites. Her reputation traveled differently. People described her as sharp, relentless, and fearless in court. Some even said she had built her career by taking on cases other lawyers considered too complicated. That sounded exactly like the kind of person I needed. I called her office and expected to reach an assistant, but after 2 rings, a calm voice answered. Grant Legal Chambers. I introduced myself and briefly explained that I was dealing with a contract dispute and needed a consultation. The assistant asked a few quick questions and then said something I didn't expect. Miss Grant has an opening tomorrow morning. The next day, I walked into Amelia Grant's office feeling very different from the way I had walked into Whitmore's. There were no polished marble floors or walls filled with expensive awards. Instead, the office felt simple, focused, and quiet. Amelia herself greeted me at the door. She was confident but approachable, with sharp eyes that seemed to notice every detail in the room. Charlotte Whitfield, she said with a warm handshake. Please come in. We sat down at a small table instead of a large, intimidating desk, and she asked me to explain everything from the beginning. I told her about Oliver Kensington, the contract dispute, the documents I had gathered, and the strategy Whitmore had recommended. I also told her about the clause in the contract and the emails that supported my position. Unlike Whitmore, Amelia didn't interrupt. She listened carefully, occasionally jotting down notes while I spoke. When I finished, she held out her hand. May I see the documents? I passed the folder across the table. She opened it and began reading quietly. The room stayed silent except for the soft sound of pages turning. A few minutes later, Amelia looked up at me, her expression thoughtful. Why did your previous lawyer ignore this clause? She asked. I let out a small breath. He called it a technicality. Amelia leaned back slightly and shook her head. That clause isn't a technicality. It's leverage. My eyes widened a little. Leverage? Yes, she said, tapping the document gently. If Oliver Kensington agreed to this condition in writing, it weakens his entire argument. Hearing someone say that out loud felt like a light switching on in a dark room. For the first time since the legal battle began, a lawyer wasn't dismissing my observations. She was confirming them. Amelia continued reviewing the file, occasionally asking clear and direct questions. Each time I answered, she nodded slowly as if connecting pieces of a puzzle. Finally, she closed the folder and looked directly at me. "Charlotte, I'm going to be honest with you," she said. My heart skipped slightly, preparing for bad news. But what she said next changed everything. "Your case is stronger than you think." I felt the tension in my shoulders release a little. "Then why did Whitmore push for a settlement?" Amelia gave a small shrug. "Some lawyers prefer quick resolutions. Complex fights require time and energy." She paused briefly before adding, "But if you want to challenge Kensington properly, there is definitely a path forward." That sentence stayed with me for the rest of the meeting. A path forward. When I walked out of Amelia Grant's office later that day, the sky above London looked brighter than it had in weeks. I no longer felt like someone being supervised or dismissed. I felt like someone who had finally found the right ally. And as I stood there on the sidewalk, holding the same folder of documents that Whitmore had brushed aside, I realized something powerful. The biggest mistake Edward Whitmore made was assuming I would quietly accept his judgment. Because what he didn't understand was that the moment he told me I needed supervision was the exact moment he pushed me toward the lawyer who was about to turn my entire case around. And what happened next in the courtroom would prove just how wrong he had been. If you've made it this far into the story, make sure you subscribe and stay with me for the final face, because the day we faced Oliver Kensington in court was the day everything finally came into the open. The morning of the hearing arrived with a quiet kind of tension that filled the air long before I even reached the courthouse. London was waking up slowly as I stepped out of the taxi and looked up at the tall stone building where my case would finally be heard. For weeks my life had revolved around documents, emails, meetings, and long conversations with Amelia Grant. Every piece of evidence had been examined carefully. Every argument had been prepared with precision. But standing there that morning, I realized something important. This moment was not just about the case anymore. It was about proving that I had been right to trust my instincts when something felt wrong. Amelia arrived a few minutes later carrying the same calm confidence she always had. She greeted me with a reassuring nod. "Ready?" she asked. I took a deep breath and nodded back. Ready. Inside the courthouse the atmosphere was serious and focused. Lawyers walked through the corridors carrying files while clients sat quietly on wooden benches waiting for their cases to be called. When we entered the courtroom, my eyes immediately found Oliver Kensington sitting at the opposite table with his legal team. He looked confident, almost relaxed, like a man who believed the outcome was already decided. For months he had pushed the story that I misunderstood the contract, that the agreement we signed never included the conditions I claimed. And for months Edward Whitmore had seemed ready to accept that narrative. But today the situation was different. Today Amelia Grant was standing beside me. When the judge entered the courtroom, everyone rose to their feet. The room fell silent as the hearing began. Oliver's lawyer spoke first, repeating the same arguments they had used from the beginning. He claimed the contract language was vague, that my interpretation was emotional rather than factual, and that the disagreement was simply a misunderstanding between business partners. As I listened, I felt a strange calmness settle inside me. Weeks earlier those words might have shaken my confidence. But now I knew something they didn't expect. When it was Amelia's turn to speak, she stood slowly and walked to the center of the courtroom with quiet confidence. Her voice was steady and clear as she began explaining the timeline of events. She guided the judge step by step through the agreement, the negotiations, and the written confirmations between Oliver and me. Then she reached the document that Edward Whitmore had once dismissed as a technicality. The clause in the contract. Amelia held the document up and read the exact wording aloud. The courtroom grew noticeably quieter as the meaning of the clause became clear. Oliver Kensington had agreed to the condition in writing. Not vaguely. Not emotionally. Clearly and directly. Amelia then presented the supporting emails that confirmed the agreement again. Each piece of evidence fit together like parts of a puzzle that had been ignored for far too long. I glanced across the room and noticed something interesting. Oliver's confident expression had changed. The calm certainty he walked in with was beginning to fade. His lawyers leaned closer together, whispering quietly while Amelia continued presenting the evidence. When she finished speaking, the courtroom remained silent for a moment while the judge reviewed the documents in front of him. Those few seconds felt longer than the entire morning. Finally, the judge looked up and addressed both sides. His voice was calm but firm as he summarized the evidence that had just been presented. The contract clause was clear. The supporting communications confirmed it. The argument that the condition never existed simply didn't match the written record. Hearing those words felt like a weight lifting from my shoulders. The truth that had been ignored for months was finally being recognized. As the hearing concluded, I sat quietly for a moment, absorbing everything that had happened. My mind drifted back to the first day I sat in Edward Whitmore's office and heard him say I needed supervision. At the time those words had made me question myself. But now I understood something important. Sometimes the people who underestimate you are the very people who push you to find your real strength. When we stepped outside the courthouse, the sunlight felt warmer than it had that morning. Amelia smiled slightly and said something simple but powerful. You trusted your instincts. I nodded, realizing how true that was. If I had ignored that uneasy feeling after Whitmore dismissed my concerns, I might have accepted a settlement that never reflected the truth. Instead, I chose to ask questions, look deeper, and find the right person to fight beside me. And that decision changed everything. So if there is one lesson from my story, it's this: never let someone convince you that your voice doesn't matter in your own fight. Sometimes the moment someone says you need supervision is the exact moment you realize you need a new direction. If you've followed this story from the beginning, thank you for being here. And before you go, I'm curious about something. Drop a comment and tell me which country you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how many different places people connect with stories like this. And if you enjoyed this journey, make sure you subscribe so